All good. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And thanks to the people on Zoom as well. I think we've got people tuning in from Norfolk Island, Tasmania, family in Sydney, supervisors in Tahiti. I think that's right. Yeah. So I tried to get Daniel to do a PhD on naughty miners after he did some really great honours with us on regions in the Cape Tea. But for some reason he decided that Norfolk Island parrots would be a better option for some reason. Anyway, he's done a great job. He's done an extremely efficient PhD. So without further ado, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Ross, for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who's come in person and to those online tuning in. Today I'm here to talk about my thesis that I've been doing the last few years, and it's titled The Breeding Biology and Population Dynamics of the Norfolk Island Green Parrot. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the Canberra region from where I'm presenting today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So to give you a quick overview of my talk today, I'm firstly going to talk a little bit about island conservation and biodiversity on islands. I'll then give a bit of an introduction to the Norfolk Island green parrot itself before discussing my thesis aims. Then I'll talk about the 5 chapters of my thesis, and for each of those I'll provide the rationale, the methods, key findings, and also a summary of what it all means for management. And lastly, I'll try to sum up the implications of my thesis for future management of the green parrot. So, in terms of island biodiversity, islands are biodiversity hotspots, and long periods of isolation lead to a disproportionately large number of endemic species occurring on islands. One paper found that 8.1 times the amount of endemic vertebrates occur on islands compared to mainlands, and islands have 9.5 times the endemic richness of plants as well. And island ecosystems are also very unique. So one thing that's unique about islands are top predators are often absent on islands. And this is particularly true for mammals. Also, there's generally a lower level of species richness overall. And this means that there are fewer interspecific competitors for island dwelling species. And these in combination can lead to something known as island syndrome, which is a suite of particular traits commonly occurring on in island dwelling species. So these include things like size changes, so dwarfism and gigantism, also loss of vigility, so the classic case is the loss of flight in birds, slower life histories, and also a loss of fear of predators. So a few examples of these are up on the slide here. They include the kakapo, a flightless parrot, also the heaviest in the world, the Galapagos tortoises, and the coconut crab. But it's worth noting that all of these species are also vulnerable. So in short, island species are often both physiologically and behaviourally distinct, but they're also very vulnerable. So it's probably not a surprise then that islands don't have the best track record when it comes to conservation and extinctions. Nearly 75% of extinctions since European exploration around the world have been island-dwelling species. These include some of your really most well-known extinctions, such as the dodo of Mauritius, the thylacine of Tasmania, and also the bramble cay malamis, which went extinct in 2019 in the Torres Strait. But the issue for island endemics doesn't stop there, with nearly 50% of all threatened species, according to the IUCN, being island-dwelling species. And this can partly be explained by some of their common challenges, that they face. So persecution on islands is often very quick, so that's persecution by humans. Invasive species are particularly damaging, particularly given that lack of top predators occurring naturally, and also the lower interspecific competition. Land clearance and climate change both reduce the habitat available for species to live in. And of course, on islands, this habitat may already be limited. So species have nowhere to go. And also fairly unique to islands is the fact that they have small founding populations and persistently small population sizes over time, which can result in a reduced genetic diversity, which may limit their ability to adapt to change or could reduce their fitness through things like inbreeding depression in serious cases. So this brings me to the Norfolk Island green parrot, which unfortunately is a really good example of an endangered island endemic. As the name suggests, it's only found on Norfolk Island, which you can see, hopefully you can see it there, that tiny speck in the middle of the ocean. It's very small and isolated, approximately 1,500 kilometres off the coast of Australia, and it's only 35 kilometres squared in size. Since the arrival of Europeans on Norfolk Island, the population has seen a pretty rapid decline, possibly up to 90%. And more recently, the population has fluctuated in size, with the most recent low point being in 2013, when there were less than 100 individuals reported on the island. Since then, with help of management on Norfolk Island, the population has recovered and is probably more likely around the 500 individuals mark now. Yet it's still an endangered species and one of the Australian government's top 20 priority bird species for conservation. So in terms of threats, there's been a great deal of land clearance on Norfolk Island, which has drastically reduced the amount of habitat available for the birds. And this is particularly true for the loss of hollow-bearing trees, which they require for breeding sites. Also invasive predators being rats and cats, and also invasive competitors. So mostly crimson rosellas, European honeybees, and common starlings. These all compete for those already limited number of nest sites. And also the small population size of the green parrot and past population bottlenecks over the last 50, 100 years could pose genetic risks for the species. So this could potentially result in reduced fitness over time. Now, in terms of management, the Norfolk Island National Park was established in the 1980s and it's managed by Parks Australia. And most of the green parrot breeding habitat occurs within the park. Park staff undertake regular predator and competitor control for cats, rats, and crimson rosellas. But there's a major emphasis placed on the modification and management of known and potential green parrot nest sites. So this mostly involves existing natural hollows that are then fortified using things like metal sheeting around the entrance and also cement to block holes to make them secure from predators. However, there are also some fully artificial sites that have been designed for the green parrot specifically. And these nest sites have been a really crucial tool for the recovery of the species, and they're seen as the major driver of population growth on Norfolk Island. It's also worth noting that other things have been tried, other management techniques for the green parrots, including an unsuccessful attempt at a captive breeding program and also a translocation to nearby Phillip Island, which is predator-free. So the Norfolk Island green parrot is a difficult bird to conserve. And I think these two articles provide quite a good image of the plight of the green parrot. So they're approximately 30 years apart and both talk about pretty drastic measures to rescue the green parrot. So despite that management during this time, we've still found ourselves struggling to conserve the species. So that brings me to the overall aim of the thesis, which is to fill knowledge gaps so that we can prevent another rescue being required for the species. So in terms of specific aims, we're looking to improve our understanding of the breeding biology of the species. We want to establish the genetic status of the population and also examine the population dynamics of the green parrot. And all of this is with the goal of informing future conservation management of the species. So in terms of my thesis structure, my thesis is 5 standalone papers, all at various stages of the publication process. and all of them broadly fit into two categories, being breeding and population dynamics. But there is quite a lot of overlap between those two. So the first chapter is a meta-analysis of non-lethal nest protection measures to protect birds against predation. So that takes a view beyond the green parrot and looks at birds more generally. The second chapter looks at the preferences of green parrots and crimson rosellas, their major competitor, for the predator-proof nest sites on Norfolk Island. Chapter 3 is a population modelling exercise looking at the growth of the population between 2013 and 2021. Chapter 4 takes a look at green parrot breeding biology with a specific focus on the difference between predator-proof nests and natural nests. And last but not least, chapter 5 looked at the population genetics of the birds. So now I'll take you through a bit of an overview of each of those chapters to give you an idea about what they're all about. So the first chapter is a meta-analysis of non-lethal methods to protect wild birds from nest predation. And this is currently in review with the Journal of Applied Ecology. So the rationale behind this paper is firstly that nest protection is an important part of green parrot conservation. But more broadly, nest protection is common for many birds around the world to reduce nest predation. And increasingly, there's been interest in non-lethal nest protection methods, and this is largely because it circumvents many of the ethical issues with lethal protection, particularly when you're dealing with native predator species. So the overall aims of this paper were to provide a global overview of research on non-lethal nest protection methods for birds, and also to examine the efficiency of these different methods and test the factors that may influence this efficiency. Okay, so to conduct our literature research, we came up with a big Boolean search string and used it to search two search engines, Web of Science and Scopus. And we were looking for papers that fit our specific inclusion criteria. Some of these were that the papers needed to talk about non-lethal interventions, they needed to be peer-reviewed papers, experiments conducted in situ, and they also specifically had to be targeting nest predation rather than any other threats to nesting birds. We were looking for quantitative studies that gave some measure of nest success. So for this paper, we didn't include changes to nest productivity. And our screening involved multiple stages. So the first of which was the title and abstract screening, for which we had 1,297 papers. We then excluded a bunch of papers for various reasons, for not fitting our inclusion criteria, and we were left with 180 papers at the full text stage. So we reviewed 180 papers in full and excluded 113 of these that weren't suitable for our meta-analysis. We extracted data for 67 of these papers, and we also found an additional 13 papers through citation searching. So this involves going through the citation lists and reference lists of those included papers to look for any papers that you may have missed in the initial search. So altogether, we had 80 papers to review. In terms of data extraction, we looked to extract data that we could use to calculate an effect size. So for this, we used log odds ratio, and we needed to find a measure of nest success for both a control and a treatment group. We also extracted data for 5 variables of interest. So you can see 4 of these listed up here, being the type of intervention that was used, the predator taxon being protected against, the position of that nest, so whether it was in a hollow on the ground or elevated off the ground like a cup nest. And the 4th variable was experiment type, so whether it was a natural nest experiment or an artificial nest experiment. And lastly, not shown there is the prey family of the bird being protected, which we also had an interest in. We also extracted 4 methodological variables. So these were the duration of the study, whether nest success was measured as a binary outcome or a rate, also how failure was defined, and the period over which success was measured. In terms of analysis, we had 104 effect sizes from 80 papers. So those extra 24 effect sizes come from splitting papers into study units when they represented more than one intervention or multiple predator families, things like that. And we use the package metaphor in R, which is specifically designed for meta-analyses. And we use this to fit univariate mixed effects models to test the impact of those variables of interest. We used AIC, or Archaic Information Criterion, to establish the most parsimonious models. And then in order to test the methodological variables that I listed before, we added those variables to the most parsimonious model. So in terms of results, firstly, trends in research, we found studies from 20 different countries and one overseas territory, being St. Helena. More than 50% of studies were conducted in North America, and there was also an overall bias towards the global north. More than 75% of studies involved ground nesting species, and this was particularly true for plover species, which were involved in a third of all studies. And overall, our review included protection efforts for 22 families of birds and 65 species. Interestingly, less than 3% of the studies looked at endangered species or critically endangered species. And somewhat concerningly, more than 50% were conducted over a single, of those experiments were conducted over a single breeding season. So ideally, we want to see multiple seasons represented in those studies to account for differing conditions between years, which could extend things like predation. And overall, there were very highly variable approaches used between these studies, which was often dictated by the study system and the study species. In terms of their efficiency, exposures, fences, and guards, so interventions that physically blocked predator access, all had a positive effect on nest success. Behavioural interventions, on the other hand, which are those that don't fit, which we defined as those that don't physically block access, but rather act to change behaviour of those predators, so things like deterrence, diversionary feeding, and you can see a few more of those listed at the top right of panel A. They did not show evidence of a significant positive impact. Target predator and the prey family also had a significant influence on effectiveness, but these findings were limited by some small sample size of those factor levels. And none of the methodological variables that we tested had an impact on the effectiveness reported in each of those studies. So in summary, current evidence suggests that physical interventions are more effective than behavioural interventions at improving nest success. There were lots of biases in the data set, so specifically towards North America and also ground nesting species. But on a positive note, novel methods such as chemical camouflage and also studies outside of North America were becoming increasingly common in the literature. We also made some recommendations for future studies, specifically that in order to increase their value to conservation, studies should clearly state the overall aims of their experiment. They should take place over multiple seasons where possible, and they should also strive to use a comparable control group. And we listed these because we found there were potential limiting factors for the overall value of those studies for future work. So on to chapter 2. The second chapter looked at the use of modified nest sites by green parrots and their main competitor species, the crimson rosella. And this paper is now published in Restoration Ecology. So the rationale behind this paper was that predator-proof nest sites are a key management focus for green parrots, but many of these nests haven't been used, and also a number are routinely used by crimson rosellas. So overall, the nest preferences of both of those species on Norfolk Island aren't entirely clear. So the aims of this paper were to establish an understanding of both species' nest preferences and also to inform the management and development of future nest sites. So in terms of data collection, we went around to all 71 of the predator-proof nest sites within the Norfolk Island National Park. and we collected 13 nest attributes there. And you can see those attributes listed in the dot points there. And also you can see a example of a modified, so a natural hollow that's been modified on the right-hand side of the slide there. So a few examples of these attributes were entrance height, the dimensions of the entrance itself, and also the foundations on which the nest was built. So whether it was a completely artificial nest or if it had a natural base that had been fortified. And we combined this with 8 years of nesting data collected by the Norfolk Island National Parks team. They collected this data between 2013 and 2020, and it specifically looked at nest use by both green parrots and crimson rosellas. So in terms of data analysis, we fitted generalized linear models to test the impact of those nest attributes I listed before. And we were testing the impact of these on 4 response variables, specifically whether a nest was used by green parrots, how many times it was used by green parrots, and the same too for crimson rosellas. We also tested for spatial order correlation, which is essentially whether the proximity of one nest to another used nest has an influence on its nest use status. We also tested whether use by one species influenced nest use by the other species. And you can see in the graph on the right some of the variability, the spread of those nest sites, and also the variability in the number of times each is used. Now, in terms of results, for the green parrot, they used 54% of nest sites, and on average, nests that were used, we used 5.2 times, ranging from 1 use to 12 uses. And green parrots only use nests with natural foundations, so they would not use fully artificial nests. And we also found that usage had a positive relationship with wall width. So you can see in the graph on the right-hand side there that those with thicker walls were more likely to be occupied by green parrots. However, none of the variables that we tested had an influence on the number of uses by green parrots. In terms of crimson rosella nest use, 42% of nest sites were used by crimson rosellas. And on average, the nest that they did use, they used 2.8 times, ranging from 1 to 7 uses. Crimson rosellas used more than 1/3 of the sites that green parrots used. And interestingly, they also used nearly a quarter of the sites were only used by crimson rosellas. None of the variables that we tested explained crimson rosella use, either in terms of whether a nest was used or how many times it was used. So this also extended to them being happy to use those fully artificial nest sites designed for green parrots. So in summary, artificial nests designed for green parrots, an example of which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, are only being used by their main competitor species, the crimson rosella. And this shows that some restorative actions could have the potential to support non-target species. So target species specific nest designs are crucial in this type of management, but of course that's not possible without a thorough understanding of the breeding biology and the nest preferences of both of those species. And really this paper also highlights the importance of ongoing monitoring and assessment of management actions to make sure they're still working as well as they can. So the third chapter involved the use of stochastic population models to look at the green parrot population growth since 2013. And this is now published in EMU Austral Ornithology. So the rationale behind this paper is that predator-proof nests are seen as the primary source of population growth for the green parrot. And rapid population growth was observed since that low point I mentioned before in 2013, when there were less than 100 individuals. Yet in 2021, when we arrived on the island, it seemed that most birds were unmarked, so didn't have bands. And this is despite systematic banding of nestlings in those predator-proof managed nest sites since 2013. So this was quite surprising, as if they were nesting predominantly in those nest sites, we would assume most birds would be banded in the 2021 population. So essentially the population dynamics underlying this are somewhat unclear. So the aim of this paper was to simulate population growth scenarios between 2013 and 2021. And we did this to identify the most probable population dynamics that could explain both the percentage of birds banded in the 2021 population and that rapid population growth since 2013. And this was done with a particular focus on whether birds were nesting outside of those managed nest sites. So firstly, we wanted to determine the percentage of birds in the 2021 population that were banded. And so to do this, we conducted 2 5-day surveys in March and May of 2021. This involved me covering approximately 64 kilometres worth of tracks and off track looking for green parrots. And when I found them, I would confirm their banding status with both binoculars and a 300mm camera lens. You can see an example of a banded green parrot on the right there. Hopefully you can see the little bands on their legs. So that's what I was looking for, and it's much harder than this photo suggests to find those little bands on them. So I have to warn you, for this part of the methods, it's quite complicated and difficult to explain. So I'll do my best, but if you want to dig into the methods a little bit further, the paper is available online and is open access. So for this population modelling exercise, we use stochastic population models in a program called Vortex. And this program is often used for population viability analyses, or PVAs. And there are only a few instances that I could find of the use of these models for hindcasting. So it's a fairly novel application of this program that we used. We use demographic variables for the green parrot when known. Otherwise, we substituted them with the closely related Cyanoramphus genus species. And this paper was theoretical, so there are a number of assumptions involved, and I don't have time to discuss them all today, but as mentioned, the paper's available online if you'd like to dig into them. So we conducted sensitivity analysis, and this was done in order to test which impacts have the most impact on overall population growth. And based on this, we allowed 4 parameters in our models to vary. So specifically, mortality rate, the initial population size in the 2013 in 2013, the number of nests available for natural nesting birds, and also the mortality rate and productivity of females nesting in natural nests. And you can see a few more of the parameters used on the right-hand side of the page here. So in terms of the population modelling itself, we modelled 2 different population scenarios. So firstly, we modelled the population as a single population in which birds were only able to breed in predator-proofed managed nest sites. And thankfully, most of the demographic variables needed for these nest sites are already known due to constant monitoring of these nests by park staff. We then also created meta-population models in which we assumed there were 2 subpopulations. So some birds nesting in managed nests only, and others nesting in natural nests. And so for this study, we assumed that they were breeding separately, and that the dispersal from the managed population to the natural population was one way and occurred when the managed nest sites were saturated. So we knew this to be when 21 nest sites were occupied, which was the average number of nests used each year. So then we used formula in Vortex to determine the percentage of birds dispersing to the natural population, and also the percentage of females breeding in each of those populations. And both of these were limited by the number of nests available. So we needed to make a number of corrections to the model outputs in order to account for missed banding opportunities, the dispersal of banded birds, and also up to 25% band loss. So this can be seen on the right-hand side in that diagram. And lastly, we selected plausible models based on the production of a comparable percentage of banded birds to that observed in the 2021 population, and we considered this to be within 5% of that observation. So in terms of results, I found 109 birds, and 68 of those birds, for 68 of those birds, I could determine their banding status. And only about 18% of birds surveyed in 2021 were banded. And this was later confirmed when we conducted mist netting and got a similar ratio of banded birds, I believe almost to the second decimal place. In terms of the single population model results, they produced a median population size of 206. They're seen in red on the right-hand side. And this couldn't account for the large population growth that was observed between 2013 and 2021, and also couldn't explain the percentage of birds banded in the 2021 population. The meta-population models, on the other hand, had a median population estimate of 635. They're seen in blue, and this could account for the large population growth since 2013, and 31 model variations also were able to explain the percentage of birds banded in 2021, and this include a combination of all parameter variables. So in summary, meta-population models were better at explaining the population growth and banding status of the green parrot than the single population models. And this suggests that most birds in the contemporary population have probably hatched in unprotected nest sites. Birds are choosing to nest in these natural nest sites, despite approximately 50 predator-proof nest sites remaining unoccupied and available each year. And this may indicate that broad-scale predator control is allowing more natural nest success and could be supporting a large proportion of the overall breeding population. So on to chapter 4. In chapter 4, we compared a sample of natural nest with a sample of predator-proof nest sites. And this paper is currently in preparation, but hopefully we'll be submitting this soon. So the rationale for this paper was, as I just mentioned, population models indicated that many birds are probably breeding in unprotected natural nest sites. Yet a sample of natural nests have never been studied, as known nest sites, when they're found, are often immediately predator-proofed to protect them from rats and cats. So the aim of this study was to compare the productivity, success, and attributes of protected nest sites with the attributes, success, and productivity of unprotected nest sites. And we also aim to examine the breeding parameters and recent trends in reproduction for the species. So I searched for nests over the last 3 years for natural nest sites on Norfolk Island. And when active nests were found, they were monitored using some some manual checks, and also using Reconyx cameras that either recorded video or took photos. Predator-proof nests, on the other hand, were monitored by park staff from 2013. But in addition, I monitored 11 active predator-proof nests over the last 3 years to increase the quality and the amount of footage that we had of those nests. In terms of nest characteristics, we repeated the measurements that were taken at predator-proof nest sites, and those were the same as the ones that I mentioned in chapter 2. So in terms of methods, we conducted daily survival rate modelling in a program called MARC, and we tested the impact of 6 variables. So firstly, the nest type, whether it was natural or predator-proofed, the nest timing, specifically the year of nesting, and also the month of egg laying. And we tested 3 nest attributes that we hypothesized could have an influence on nest success. So these were entrance height, chamber depth, and wall width. We use GLMs again with the number of fledglings as the response variable, and we tested the same variables as above. So this was done for productivity modelling. And in order to compare the characteristics of both nest types, we did this using Welch's t-tests. So we had 220 nests included in our sample. And the mean clutch size we found was 5.2, the mean brood size of 3.1, and nests on average produced 1.97 fledglings. And most egg laying, as you can see from the panel A in the picture on the right, most egg laying occurred between December and June, and breeding also occurred all year, but you can see the variability in the number of nests per month from those large error bars. And as you can see in plot B, there was a lower number of nests recorded in 2021 and 2022, which we think could be potentially climate driven due to some strange rainfall years, but this is yet to be investigated further. In terms of average nest success, predator-proof nests had nearly 75% success rate, which was much higher than unprotected nests, of which only 40% were successful. And DSR was significantly higher in predator-proof nests than in unprotected nest sites. So you can see that on the graph on the right-hand side here. But you can also see that for unprotected nests, the error bars are very large due to our small sample size. And in terms of our productivity models, none of the variables that we tested significantly explained nest productivity. In terms of nest characteristics, we found 13 natural nest sites and compared their characteristics with 71 predator-proof nests. And we found that natural nests had lower entrance heights and also shorter nest chambers than their predator-proof counterparts. You can see both of these measures in panel A and panel B of the plot here. And in panel C, you can see the mean nest dimensions of both predator-proof and unprotected nests. And you can see that those are quite different from one another. So in summary, predator-proofing of nests is clearly increasing their success. And this seems to be preventing instances of predation like the ones you can see on the right-hand side of the page here. Both of these were recorded at natural nest sites and involved the two key predators, rats and cats. We also found that natural nests had different nest characteristics from their predator-proofed counterparts, and this could indicate a preference for these nests over the predator-proof nests, as many suitable protected sites remain unused each year. We also found that nesting has been decreasing in the last couple of years, possibly due to those extreme rainfall years, but further investigation is needed to confirm this. So last but not least, chapter 5 looked at the genetics, the population genetics of the green parrot. And this is currently in review with conservation genetics. So the rationale behind this paper is that the green parrot's history may have led to a significant impact on their current genetics. And this could have implications for their future fitness and their ability to adapt to change. And it also could have an influence on how the species is managed in the future. And of course, the population genetics of the species haven't yet been studied. So the aim of this paper were to assess the genetic diversity and inbreeding of the contemporary population. We also looked to estimate the effective population size, and we aim to confirm the lack of an expected lack of structure in the population. So we didn't expect that there'd be any subpopulations due to the small size of the island, but we wanted to make sure. And we also looked to test for genetic evidence in the species' current genetics to see any evidence of past population bottlenecks. So in terms of data collection, genetic samples were taken from nestlings, mostly by park staff at predator-proof nest sites, and this was done between 2015 and 2022. In 2021 and 2022, I also looked to find genetic material opportunistically. So this could be feathers that were found on the ground or scattered around nest sites, things like that. So this was done to increase the overall sample. And lastly, in 2021 and 2022, we undertook misnetting in order to get a random representative sample from the island. So we deemed this necessary because all of the samples collected at those natural nest sites are more likely to be siblings as they occur multiple times over the years at the same nest sites. So we wanted to have a less biased sample, and in order to do this, we tried to find unrelated birds from across the island. So in terms of lab work, once we had the DNA samples, with the help of my supervisor, Linda Neves, I extracted and quantified the DNA of 188 samples. These were then sent to Diversity Arrays Technology at UC for processing. And once they were returned, we used the program DartR to do quality filtering, and also used the program Sequoia to find duplicates. And this left 157 unique samples in our dataset. And as I mentioned before, because our samples were potentially biased in terms of their collection, we thought there would be an abnormally large number of siblings included in our dataset. So we also chose to analyse a second dataset for which we removed these closely related birds. And we did this again using Sequoia, and this dataset had 72 individuals. So we used predominantly this dataset for our analysis, but we also used that full unfiltered dataset. We did most of our diversity analysis in the DartR package, but we also used the program Structure for analysis of structure. And we performed coalescent simulation testing in FastSimCol, and this was done to test for that evidence of population bottlenecks. So in terms of results, diversity in breeding, nearly 1 in 5 birds were highly inbred, and we considered this to be an inbreeding coefficient of more than 0.125, which is equivalent to a half sibling breeding pair. Approximately 5% of birds were very highly inbred, considered to be an inbreeding coefficient of more than 0.25, and this is equivalent to a full sibling breeding pair. We found an effective population size of 44 individuals, which is small, but somewhat as expected given the past history of the birds, and possibly better than we expected given its history. Observed heterozygosity did not differ significantly from expected heterozygosity, and also the average relatedness of birds was quite low at 0.033. And you can see in this image on the right-hand side of the screen, those are all the sampling sites of our DNA, with latitude and longitude removed because they're potentially sensitive. And you can see that those misnetted sites in blue are generally include fewer samples and spread across a larger area. In terms of structure, our results confirm that there is a single population on Norfolk Island with no population structure apparent. So you can see this PCA plot on the right-hand side of the page. If there were subpopulations, you'd expect clusters of dots around that axis. And as you can see, it's quite random. So just a single population. We also tested 4 different population bottleneck scenarios. So the first was a population with no prior bottlenecks. Second, we had a population with just a single recent population bottleneck since the arrival of Europeans on Norfolk Island in the 1700s. Third was a population with a single old population bottleneck, which represented their dispersal to the island from New Caledonia a couple of 1,000 years ago. And fourth, we had a population with both an old population bottleneck and a new population and a recent population bottleneck. And our modelling results from FastSimCol strongly supported the recent and old bottleneck scenario, followed by just the recent bottleneck scenario. So, in summary, current affected population size at 44 indicates that there is a high risk of inbreeding depression in the short term for this species. So that is quite concerning. As expected, the green parrot is operating as a single genetic unit, and our results suggest that there's a need to promote nesting by as many pairs as possible to preserve that genetic diversity for future generations. Also, our population genetic results should be considered when designing future management of the species. So, for example, if another translocation were to be designed, these results could be really useful for that. So to finish, I thought I would try to summarise what I think the findings of my thesis mean for the future management of the green parrot. So firstly, predator proofing increases nest success clearly, but nest occupancy is still low at these sites, and some sites are only supporting non-target species. Birds are still choosing to nest in natural nest sites, and this is possibly due to those sites more closely displaying their natural nest preferences. Our population modelling suggests that most birds, that a large proportion of the population is nesting in those natural nests, and this may suggest that broad-scale predator control is allowing more nests, natural nests, to be successful. Our genetic results also highlight the need to promote as much nesting by as many birds as possible to preserve genetic diversity for future generations. And all of this really indicates the importance of prioritising a combination of management measures that can support the entire breeding population on Norfolk Island. So lastly, there are a few people that I need to thank. Firstly, to my supervisors, Rob, Ross, Dee, Linda, Nick, Lewis, and Penny. Without your support and your expertise, this thesis wouldn't have been possible. So I'm extremely grateful for that. I'm also grateful for the funding that I've received from the Director of National Parks, BirdLife Australia, and the Ecological Society of Australia. I'm extremely thankful for all the help and support I've received from collaborators at Norfolk Island National Parks and also Parks Australia. So to mention just a few of them, Mel Wilson, Nigel Greenup, Joel Christian, Nick McGregor, and Eric Dorr. And I'd also like to thank the Norfolk Island community for welcoming me into their home to do this research. And lastly, thank you to all those who've made my PhD an enjoyable experience. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I can take some questions.
Excellent talk, and you're really well done, very clear, and the amount of work you've done is seriously impressive in that time. So
Thank you.
we've got 10 minutes for questions, and Vicky, if you're able to coordinate questions from Zoom, we're good to go. Yeah, David.
Oh, nice. Thanks. Great PhD, really.
Thank you.
I was curious with the artificial nest sites and the use of them by crimson rosellas. Are there any talks about like removing the eggs and stuff in those nests, because otherwise you can't risk maybe potentially artificially increasing that population as well by giving them more opportunities to nest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there've been a number of talks about that sort of thing, and as part of management, if there were crimson rosella eggs found, they would be removed, because the crimson rosella is also controlled on Norfolk Island in general. But I guess ideally we wouldn't have them breeding in those sites at all. So yeah, in an ideal world, we would try to make modifications to make them more suitable for green parrots, as those are who we're trying to target, I guess. Does that answer you?
Yeah.
Any questions from Zoom?
Not yet.
No.
Yeah, Phil?
I have a follow-up question from the second. I was just wondering, like, if the crimson rosella is taking the artificial nest, will that reduce the competition of the nest site between the rosella and the green parrots?
Yeah, it's a good point. It is definitely a good point. And I think it does have potential for that, but because they don't display particular nest preferences at all, they're also very happy to use the nest that green parrots do like. And so, yeah, it may not entirely relieve the pressure, because they'll use all of those sites at the end of the day. Yeah, Phil?
I was wondering, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Lentoling was successful about in protecting this with the green parrot was about two.
Yep.
Is that pretty good? And two, does that sort of suggest, if it's pretty good, does it suggest that there's another issue post nesting that is also an issue that is limiting population growth?
So firstly, that too also includes nests that fail at earlier stages. So probably if you only include nests that hatched young, they would be more like three fledglings being produced. And I've got to say, I'm not entirely sure how it compares to other parrot species, but generally if nests were producing 3 young or even 2 young, it's a pretty good success rate. So potentially the thing that's actually limiting those predator-proof nest sites is not how successful they're being, because those protection measures are working. It's possibly more how many nests are being initiated in the first place. But yeah, I think overall the productivity and success of those nests is really quite good. And in terms of after those nests, it's a good question. There's certainly predation. So there's predation faced by those fledglings outside of the nest site. But we didn't really dive into that in this project yet.
Yeah, great, Tom. I had a question, maybe, sorry if I missed this, but you mentioned in one of the models that use variables from their closely related New Zealand counterpart. What is the divergence history of that in terms of timing, and are they so far apart that, I don't know, this may sound out there, but are there possible hybrid lines and things like that that are considered in terms of diversity and things like that? Or?
Yeah, so definitely worth noting that I think the IUCN doesn't classify the Norfolk Island green parrot as its own separate species. So they're quite closely related to the red-crowned parakeet in New Zealand. I couldn't tell you exactly about the divergence times, but I do also know that I believe in captivity, they're also happy to interbreed. So they're probably a fairly good match, but then there are notable characteristic changes. So the green parrot's much bigger than the red-crowned parakeet. So there likely would be some differences, but that was what we could use as a best guess, kind of grounded in some sort of research and truth. Yep.
This is a little bit off topic as well, but I was wondering with your predation from cats and rats, and you mentioned right at the beginning that tames is a classic syndrome. Do you see much anti-predator response in terms of the green parrots?
They'll alarm call people and things. If a tree branch falls and hits the ground, they'll alarm call at it. But the main problem is that they're still happy to nest on the ground. So that there's nest sites that are just tunnels below trees under the ground. And of course, that's pretty bad anti-predator behavior. And that's despite a bunch of nest sites being, at least from our point of view, being much more suitable and more protected from cats and rats. So kind of despite that, they still like to nest on the ground, which probably indicates that island syndrome, a lack of fear of those predators.
Could I follow up on that?
Yes.
So your 2 photos showed the adults being taken. Were they chicks?
No, so the cat one was a young, like really close to fledging. So it was actually at the nest entrance, and it was the last of its clutch. And yeah, one night the cat basically just grabbed it out of the entrance. So that was on the ground, and the other photo was a nesting female, and that was actually 3 meters above the ground, in an African olive tree. And that female did escape, so it wasn't a successful predation attempt, but obviously it shows the kind of clear intent of those predators. And interestingly, at that site where the female was, a rat attempted to take the female, just a few months before, with rats all over the nest, she successfully produced 3 offspring that all fledged. So there's a bit of a confusing kind of predator-prey relationship going on there, but clearly it's a threat.
I might ask one quick question.
Yeah.
As we've got time. Long-term plan for the green parrot is to establish an insurance population in another location. What do you think? What extra information do you think we need beyond what you found out to be able to do that successfully?
Well, I'm kind of I've got to say, I'm not entirely clear on what research has been done about the translocation site. So obviously site-specific stuff would be really important. If there were to be a translocation, obviously a big factor would be whether the birds are capable of flying back, as it's about 6 kilometres from Norfolk Island, Phillip Island. So, and how you actually work those things out, it's quite hard to, without experimentation, essentially. So, yeah, it's a difficult one. Yeah, Nick?
Dan, you mentioned that the population has definitely gone up and down quite a bit in the last couple of decades. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to monitor the population? Obviously, the genetics gave us information about the effective population size, but do you have thoughts of keep track of a certain number of?
Yeah, I know this has come up quite a bit in conversations. And of course, nesting activity would be quite important, but I guess one of the big questions is we have those the managed known nest sites, and it'd be great if we could quantify how much of the population is nesting in those, so we could understand if they're a good proxy for the rest of the population. And of course, other than that, count data would be great, but determining a suitable way of counting parrots that are difficult to see, blend in very well with their environment. And as you know, the terrain on Norfolk Island is fairly difficult to cover. Those just pose barriers. So I kind of don't have so many solutions, more problems. But yeah, ideally, a count would be the way to go. I think. Did you have one, George?
Just on the effective population side as well, have you used only genetic data for that, or also for activity in your demography?
Sorry, I just missed that.
Have you used only genetics for your effective population side, or already use some of the demographic data that you collected?
We did just use the I think we used any estimator using the genetic data, so we haven't incorporated the a lot of the other demographics. So perhaps we could improve that if we got some of those demographic variables. Yeah.
Cool. Last shout out to people on Zoom. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
Giselle says, not a question, but just congratulations.
Thanks, Giselle.
Well, good. Well,
All right.
thank you, Daniel, again.